Well, thank you for that introduction and good afternoon, everyone. This is our talk on race and ethnicity and inclusive language, guidance from the AMA Manual of Style. And Annette and I have been well introduced, so thank you. This slide shows our disclosures and our full titles. You'll see also that not only do we work for the AMA Manual of Style, but the JAMA Network publishes 13 journals, and they are all listed here as well. These are the current members of the AMA Manual of Style Committee. We currently have 9 individuals who represent a variety of work backgrounds and different responsibilities. All 9 of them are actual editors in the JAMA Network. So at the JAMA Network, we publish and update the AMA Manual of Style, and that helps to codify guidance and policy, but it's not just style, it's also best practices in reporting medicine and science. Just a little tidbit of information, the first edition was published in 1962. It was a little pamphlet of about 30 pages. So currently we are on the 11th edition. Starting back with the 9th edition in 1998, we included inclusive language terms, policies, and guidance. For example, this edition in 1998 acknowledged that race and ethnicity are cultural constructs. The 10th edition, which was published in 2007, expanded our inclusive language guidance. And then in February of 2020, we published the 11th edition, which expands even further better reporting on inclusive language. This section, for example, includes updates on race and ethnicity to explain why race and ethnicity might be reported in a study, how race and ethnicity were categorized in a study, and by whom. Our guidance also recommends that this information should be reported in the results section. The timeline that you're seeing here shows the evolution of the race and ethnicity reporting guidelines. So we had a major update in 2021, which included some months of drafting and review and more drafting and more review, including public comment. And the final version was published in August of 2021, not only updating the manual, but also published in JAMA itself. But we haven't been resting since August of 2021. We are deep in revision for our next topic, which will be language used to discuss sex, gender, and sexual orientation. So we're going to focus first on the race and ethnicity section of our inclusive language chapter in the AMA manual. As I noted, in the 11th edition, the AMA manual was just published in February of 2020. So why did we decide to make a major update to this section in a book that we had just published? We believe it is imperative for medical and scientific journals to use equitable, consistent, and fair language when describing patients and in articles discussing health disparities in the context of healthcare, research, education, and related activities. Inclusive language supports diversity and conveys respect. As you can see here on the slide, language that imparts bias toward or against persons or groups based on characteristics or demographics must be avoided. So the key principles in our updated race and ethnicity guidance are the following. First, an acknowledgement that race and ethnicity are social constructs. What does that mean? Race is a created concept, not a biological category defined by genetic traits or biological differences. So these terms are social constructs. They have limited utility in understanding medical research, practice, and policy. However, the terms may be useful as a lens through which to study and view racism and disparities and inequities in health, healthcare, and medical practice, education, and research. Second, there will be historical sensitivities and controversies related to terms used to describe race and ethnicity. It is paramount that researchers, writers, and editors use clear, precise, fair, and consistent terminology when reporting study participants' race and ethnicity. Also, reporting race and ethnicity should not be considered in isolation. So other sociodemographic factors and context should be included as much as feasible. These variables are key to the study of disparities and inequities in health, healthcare, and medical practice, education, and research. Fourth, it should be abundantly clear, particularly in research, what the origin of the categories is, who classified individuals, what categories were available, and how these determinations were made should be clearly described. And finally, and most important, the guidance that we've put forth is not final. So the dialogue will continue, and we are still collecting feedback and experience through activities such as this interaction with you. And we are going to update our guidance whenever relevant and necessary. So the guidance includes definitions of commonly used terms with race and ethnicity, and acknowledgement that these terms and definitions have changed, some were out of date, and that the nomenclature will continue to evolve. The guidance acknowledges concerns and controversies in healthcare and research, including the intersectionality of ancestry and heritage, social determinants of health, and other socioeconomic, structural, institutional, cultural, and demographic factors. We have guidance for reporting collective or umbrella terms for racial and ethnic categories, with, of course, a preference for self-reporting whenever possible. Capitalization, abbreviations, punctuation, alphabetical order, those are all discussed with specific guidance given, as well as a host of examples. These examples help guide researchers, writers, and authors to help formulate correct language, and we will continue to collect feedback and add more examples as necessary. So we've prepared a summary guide based on this extensive guidance, and the link that is provided here goes to a special page we've set up on inclusive language hosted by JAMA. And after this presentation, we will send the slides out so all the links are live and you'll be able to access this material. So this table is available, dedicated on this page. So the style book, as originally published, recommended capitalizing racial and ethnic terms that have a geographic base. So for example, Asian or African American, but not Black and white. So due to many concerns about racism and biases, we revisited that guidance, and we determined that the most fair, sensitive, and consistent approach would be to capitalize all racial and ethnic terms, including Black and white, except when such capitalization might be considered inflammatory. For example, an opinion piece on white supremacy. The style book, as published, also used a slash or a virgule between race and ethnicity, as you can see there on the slide. But because race and ethnicity, a lot of categories can fit underneath that terminology. And because it's inclusive in some studies, for example, they don't ask about race and ethnicity separately, but it is considered an umbrella variable. And because honestly, the slash can be really confusing in writing, we have decided not to use that at all in this term, but spell out race and ethnicity, AND, instead of using the slash. And the final example on this slide is to list categories for race and ethnicity in alphabetical order instead of by prevalence. In this situation, multiracial would be included alphabetically, but any other terms such as other or unknown, if not avoidable, would be listed last. In this slide, in the first row, the examples we give talk about using race and ethnic terms as nouns and modifiers. Our guidance suggests not using racial and ethnic terms as nouns. For example, not Blacks, not whites, but use them as modifiers instead. For example, a Black individual or a white patient. So the adjectival form may also be used as what we call a predicate adjective, as in the example here, the patients were Asian, or the patients were Black, the patients were white. The middle row on this slide is not new, but it's just a reminder that we do not hyphenate compound racial and ethnic terms, such as African American, Mexican American. We've also added a note that writers and editors should not automatically add American to racial and ethnic categories if the context is in the United States. So it is important we remind people to follow what the author provided and to query the author if it is not clear or if it's inconsistent. And finally, on this slide, we've added guidance to avoid using the term mixed race if possible, unless that was the exact term used in study data collection. It can have a negative connotation, so we prefer multiracial, multi-ethnic, or in a table, if there are a lot of rows of racial and ethnic categories, it could be more than one of the above instead. And our guidance recommends avoiding the use of abbreviations for racial and ethnic categories, unless there really is no way around it. So I'm sure you've all seen giant tables and figures where, due to space constraints, a lot of abbreviations are necessary. And if that's the case, if you are going to use an abbreviation, make sure it is clearly explained either parenthetically, or if it's in a figure, put it in a footnote or a key. And finally, on this slide, we got a lot of feedback on the term minority and the term minoritized. We recommend not using minority as a noun because it can be inaccurate or even stigmatizing, but it's okay to partner it with a descriptor such as racial and ethnic minority. Some people may prefer not to use that collective term for similar reasons. So here you can see some examples of alternatives such as underserved and underrepresented, which I'll note are not synonymous. Minoritized also created a lot of angst on our end. We struggled with it because it's not in the dictionary yet as an official term, but it is widely used. So we weighed the usage options in various sources and the feedback we received, and we determined that minoritized could be used as an adjective, but perhaps other rewording such as groups that have been historically marginalized would be better usage. I'm going to turn this over to Annette.
Thanks, Stacy. Tomas, we can't see you, so we're not getting feedback. You're all still there, right?
Yep, we're here.
Okay, thank you, Sheridan. So I'm going to take a few more examples here with our guidance for terms to avoid and terms that we recommend to use in place. One of these terms is the phrase people of color, especially because it is embraced by racial and ethnic groups that are not considered or do not identify as white or of European ancestry, and also because it's an indication of an important anti-racist, multiracial solidarity. There is concern, however, that this term can be too inclusive, so much so that it may actually erase or expunge important differences among subgroups that are to be included. So here we recommend specific racial and ethnic categories as much as possible, or if necessary, to use other umbrella terms, as we've just shown you on the previous slide. There's similar criticism, and we got a lot of feedback about this from experts who have written about this and who identify as non-white or other very specific groups. And those are the terms BIPOC for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, or BAME, which is mostly used in the UK. Similar criticisms have been lodged that these may disregard individuals' identities, that they don't include everyone, they don't represent everyone. They might eliminate specific differences, and with the case of BIPOC, could imply a hierarchy that is unintended. So here again, we recommend in reports of research not to use these terms, unless, of course, they were the actual data fields in a collection or survey instrument. We run across several examples of national terms that are not well known outside a particular country or region. Here are two examples that we came across. One was the term South African coloreds, which was used in a study, a genetic study of rheumatic heart disease from individuals in a database in South Africa. The manuscript editor who saw this manuscript brought it to my attention and said, "I'm uncomfortable with this. What should I do?" And I said, "Ask the author, what does it mean? Who is that representing?" And the author told us that it represented any admixture combination of individuals of European, Southeast Asian, and South Asian, Bantu-speaking, African, and/or Indigenous South African and hunter-gatherer ancestries. And that, so we were able to explain that in the article, and thereafter we used the term admixed African individuals, We weren't sure if that was exactly the right thing to do. The author thought it was, so we checked with the managing editor of the South African Medical Journal, who confirmed it. Yeah, this other term is a census term that is being phased out, and using admixed African individuals is what they would use as well. The second example you see here is the Canadian visible minority. I don't know how many of you do research in Canada, but this is a census term that's primarily used for employment. And like the previous example, it's another mix of Arab, Black, Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Latin American, South Asian, Southeast Asian, West Asian, and or white, essentially anyone who is not identified as an Aboriginal person. So again, in this case, we ended up explaining it and not using that specific term that would not be well recognized outside of that country or people who know what the term means. With a lot of concern about use of the word other. Obviously in research, it's commonly used, but it implies an otherness, which is perhaps not a just way of addressing specifics. When you're doing a study and these groups don't represent large numbers, then it's not uncommon to combine groups with lower representation in this collective group called other. So if that is done, we ask that they be defined. What are all the subgroups that are included in that, and justify why they were so included in this bucket. And if there's a concern about some funding agencies will not let you have small cells and tables, numbers under 10 or 5. So in that case, that's another reason why this might be used. And we're asked that authors just clearly explain what groups might be included in that case. We've got terms for language and regional descent. With regard to language, the term Latinx has been relatively recent into the lexicon. And so we advise authors and editors not to reflexively use that term. There was a Pew study done a few years ago among people who identify as Hispanic and or Latino or Latina, and a very small percentage really appreciated the use of the word. And it's meant to be a gender neutral term, but we don't use it unless it's actually been part of the study or the individual's self-reported with use of that term. You can see here lots of discussion about regional descent. And here again, there are problems with large collective terms, and often it's necessary to define all the different subterms. Say if you're using Asian ancestry, that in itself is very broad if you break it down into the subgroups, as you can see here. The term Native American is typically not used when you're describing people in the US unless it's part of a group or that so self-designates. We have preference for American Indian or Alaska Native in that case, or Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. And of course, the term Indigenous can apply to groups in many different countries, in this country, in Canada, in Australia, and others. We advise avoidance of pure biological explanations of healthcare disparities or inequities based on racial and ethnic groups for many of the reasons that Stacy has already mentioned, and primarily because of the known intersectionality of these entities with ancestry and heritage, social determinants of health, and other socioeconomic, structural, institutional, cultural, and demographic factors. So we urge caution in this case. In addition, there are well-known clinical algorithms, kidney function, for instance, assessments based on race that have been proven to be biased, unjust, and may perpetuate inequities. There are also some databases, risk scores, that are only based on people who may identify as white or of European ancestry. With those risk scores or those databases, so Framingham risk scores would be one, the UK Biobank might be another. We ask researchers to tell us if they know who is in that data set that they've used, and to recognize in the limitations section if they're not representative of all peoples. Ideally, statistical analysis of race and ethnicity would not be dichotomous of two groups. for instance, white and non-white. If there is a reason, maybe a particular assessment of a disparity to put people into these two buckets, we ask for that justification to be included in the method section and to also be addressed in the discussion section. Similar concerns are about dichotomous comparisons of specific racial groups or specific ethnic groups, for instance, Black versus white. We ask for justification if there is a reason to limit to just only two groups. This is just a brief summary of the guidance that is now provided in our 13 journals instructions for authors so that authors can see it. It's a very high level summary, and you can see it's most of what we've just discussed, that the information about how and who identified race and ethnicity be described in the method section, that reasons for that also be added, that the specific racial and ethnic categories are preferred over collective terms, and that if you use collective terms, that they be defined, that the categories be listed in alphabetical order versus order of proportion, and that these results are, if included in the study and analyzed, that they are reported in the results section. And then we link to our broader guidance here in several places, and that's what you're seeing, that link. And I think this is still me, yeah. So this is a graphic summary of findings of a cross-sectional study that was published in JAMA Network Open. It looked at major studies that were published in JAMA, the Lancet, and the New England Journal of Medicine over a 5-year period, 2015 to 2019. Total of 688 articles, studies were included in this. Approximately half of the studies, about 48% in 2015 and 51% in 2019, reported on race. So about half, no big change in that time period, but less than 15% reported on socioeconomic status, which is a subject we're going to dive into in just a few minutes. And more than 98% reported on sex. So it's just showing that. Also, what you're seeing here is the large proportion of studies that were focused on people who were identified as white, which is clearly not representative and is becoming an issue, I think, for many researchers to try and figure out how to take care of that. These authors concluded the following, and I'm just going to read you their conclusion. There's been limited progress has been made in the reporting and representation of race and socioeconomic status within medical research between 2015 and 2019. While the reporting of sex was high, the impacts of systemic racism and in medicine are being acknowledged, and it is imperative that we now address the important problems and improve the way we represent, report, and include race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status in medical research. This is a study that Stacy and I did. We wanted to assess, was there a change associated with our reporting guidance? So we looked at 3 of the journals in our network, JAMA Internal Medicine, and JAMA Pediatrics. They represent general medicine. And we looked at the studies that were published in the first 3 months of 2019 and in the first 3 months of 2022. So that was sort of the before and after. But we also did look at 3 months right before our guidance was released in May and through July of 2021, and attempt to kind of control for what was happening outside in the world, because awareness was really raising beginning in the 2020s about the importance of this, and others, not only us, were recommending better reporting. It was this involved 6 of us, and it was an independent analysis of each study by 2 independent reviewers. Discrepancies were resolved by discussion. Our inclusion criteria were that the study had to involve humans, that it reported on socio-demographic variables. We looked at where in the article race and ethnicity were reported in comparison to age and sex as other demographic variables, the number and order of race and ethnicity categories that were reported, if the category other was used, was it defined, and were race and ethnicity defined in the article. These are our results. We had 249 articles that met our criteria. And you can see there were higher percentages that reported participants' age and sex and gender, ranging from 87% to about 100%. Reporting of race and ethnicity improved between 2019 and 2022 from 57% to 67%, but that was not statistically significant. There was little change in the reporting of socioeconomic status, still relatively low, 37 to 44%. Our results are specific to reporting race and ethnicity in the research articles, and they had varying outcomes. The proportion of articles reporting specific racial and ethnic categories was higher in 2022 at 63% than in previous years, but this did not reach statistical significance. The proportion of articles that included other as a category ranged from 61% to 64%. But then you can see here the proportion that defined other increased significantly by 2022. We also saw a significant increase in the reporting of the racial and ethnic categories in alphabetical order. Not surprising, that's what we were recommending. And importantly also, we saw an increase in studies that reported how race and ethnicity were determined, which is probably one of the most important parts of our recommendations. So our study concluded that there were higher proportions of articles reporting on race and ethnicity and how they were determined and in alpha order. Some of this improvement we actually saw earlier in 2020-21, and that was probably related to our first release of our guidance before it was final. Overall, race and ethnicity are still underreported compared with age and sex, and socioeconomic status still needs a whole lot of attention, given the intersectionality of that and health disparities. This is an example of what the New England Journal of Medicine is doing, and I'm not sure if you have seen this before, but this is their editor's attempt to improve the diversity of reporting and research studies. So they require a table that looks like this, it gives authors the place to provide background on the representatives of the groups that they are studying. They publish this table as a supplement to the article. And I'm going to turn it over to Stacy to take on to our next section.
Thank you, Annette. So now for something completely different, but not really. We are in the process of updating the rest of our inclusive language chapter. So sex, gender, and sexual orientation is currently under revision. So we're kind of deep in the research and the writing, or I should say rewriting, because we already have a section in the published manual on sex, gender, and sexual orientation. But we're doing a lot of research and we're going to do a lot of feedback and revise, review, just like we did for race and ethnicity. So that is the section that's currently in the works. But we're also going to look at age and socioeconomic status, and then conditions, diseases, and abilities and disabilities will round out our inclusive language chapter. So the current guidance in the AMA manual on sex and gender reads something like this. This is also, by the way, available in all of the journal's instructions for authors. We ask authors to use the term sex when reporting biological factors and gender when reporting gender identity or psychosocial cultural factors. Authors are asked to explain in the methods how they determine sex, gender, or both. And the distribution of study participants or samples should be reported in the results section as well, not just for humans, but tissues, cells, and animals. We also ask that all participants be represented, not just the category that represents the majority of the sample. When describing individuals or, When describing individuals or groups by age, it is important not to use any terms that could be considered ageist, discriminatory, or imply a negative stereotype. A couple of them are listed here. So our preference is to use a specific age range, and you can see the last bullet point, 65 years and older. Instead of calling participants seniors or the elderly, we would prefer an exact age range versus a collective label. We've also published guidance on socioeconomic status. So when talking about people, you want to avoid labels. Terms such as low income or no income are preferred to using terms such as the poor or unemployed, or even referring to people as poor. A more descriptive term is preferred. When referring to countries instead of people, limited income, low income, resource limited, resource poor are preferred. These adjectives are used to describe a nation, region, or group in which most of the population lives on less money with less resources and public services than the population in wealthier countries. For the purposes of financing, debt relief, technical assistance, advisory services, and special initiatives, the World Bank categorizes countries as heavily indebted, poor countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries under stress, and small states. There is no universal agreed on criterion for describing a country in terms of its economic or human development, and which countries fit these different categories. Although there are different reference points, such as the gross domestic product or the nation's human development index compared with that of other nations. The choice of an appropriate term will depend on context, and writers should choose respectful terms that reflect a specific country's economic and social situations. The term third world is pejorative and archaic. So the term developing may seem like a good substitute, but it can also be pejorative and insensitive to the many complexities of metrics that are used to measure economic, political, resource, and social factors. So the best practice is to try to avoid such general terms and use something that's more specific. So for example, a country that is low income or high income when gross national product is being compared. Similar to discussing socioeconomic status, when discussing conditions, diseases, abilities, and disabilities, it's important to avoid labeling people with their condition. So person first language is generally preferred. We don't say diabetic, we say patients with diabetes. We don't say asthmatic, we say patients with asthma, etc. So there are exceptions where identity first language is preferred, such as when discussing deaf or autistic individuals. That is their preference. And there seems to be stirrings of this for other conditions as well. So we may see a shift in more identity first language as things evolve. We also recommend not describing individuals with emotional or helpless terms, such as victims or being afflicted with or suffering from. We see authors try to use victims and victimization a lot in articles at the JAMA Network. We try to reword that to describe what the person experienced. Individuals who experienced violence, experienced bullying, experienced sexual abuse. For all of these terms, afflicted with, suffering from, stricken with, usually you can just use the word with to replace it. We also prefer avoiding euphemistic descriptions such as physically challenged or special needs. And we recommend just stating what the person's condition, disease, or disability is using appropriate person first or identity first language. Except for race and ethnicity, the guidance we've discussed today is in the process of being revised and reviewed. So we'll have some official published guidance soon, but we wanted to share what was in the works along with what we already have and what we plan to keep. Any updates that we make are available in the online AMA manual, as well as eventually in the next printing of the hard copy. And they will replace the guidance that is currently there that was in the first edition. As we have discussed, the slides will be available to you after the session, and the links here are all live. They go to the race and ethnicity guidance, which is freely available both in the AMA Manual of Style and on the JAMA site. And we encourage you to read the guidance, use it, cite it, and give us feedback so we can better enhance and have more examples and particular topics that writers and editors could use for guidance. And I am once again turning this over to Annette.
Thank you, Stacy. So we thought we would try to bring this home to you all, and you do such great research in your network. We couldn't look at all of the different areas, so we just threw a dart and we took a look at the research on ALS and related disorders. We looked at articles published in the last 2 years, and there were 15 articles with human participants. All, not surprisingly, all 15 reported on age and sex of those human participants. Many, however, only reported the data for males because they were probably more proportionally there. Again, we recommend reporting all sexes or sexes and genders, depending on what the study is about. 3 reported on socioeconomic status, which was good to see. The markers for socioeconomic status that we found were education and employment. 3 reported on race and ethnicity. And these 3 articles did define the racial and ethnic categories, as we would hope, and listed them in alphabetical order. So kudos to those authors. 1 included another category, but didn't define it. So we would recommend that. And 1 explained how race and ethnicity was actually determined. And here's an example of one of the ones that we thought was really very well done. And you could see the citation here from Ebro Neuroscience Report. You can read it here, but essentially what is good to see is that it says up front how the racial census categories were defined. The categories, the 2, are listed in alphabetical order, and it actually defines what the mixed and African ancestry comprises. If this manuscript were to have been submitted to JAMA, which we would love, this is how Stacy would have edited it. You could see quickly we would have expanded SA to South African, we would have capitalized the B in Black, and we would not have used the racial categories as nouns. We would have added nouns, in this case, individuals and groups. So we hope that's helpful. I'm sure there are many others that we could have looked at, but these were the ones we were able to look at. So that wraps up our presentation, and we're now happy to have comments, questions, any kind of discussion, any examples you want to talk about. And I think probably I should stop sharing screen and we could all see each other. Does that sound right, Thomas? And
yes, I think that would be great. And I would like to thank you again, Stacy and Annette, for this very interesting presentation. I think we all deal with, or at least I think almost all of us, or maybe most of us, with publishing. But this is not just publishing, I think, what you really described, but this is very useful also when we write maybe a grant application. We can be very clear about these terminologies. And also this group and also the other groups within this diversity workforce within the RDCRN, we may have to write reports or some sort of recommendations. And I think these guidelines would also apply for those. And it is not just for publications. And I think this was very useful and very helpful. So this is now open for discussion and questions.
I'll get
that was that's the same thing that it's oh, sorry, just go ahead.
Yeah, that's a very nice presentation. Thanks. What would be, or how could you express when your statistical analysis is required to compare one's self-reported race to other races? What would be a good umbrella term to call them? Like if we say race A and the rest are no A, or how do we address that?
Right. So I think it's a very good question. And we've had a lot of conversations about this, especially starting with your grant and then all the way down to what analyses were pre-specified. So if your analyses pre-specified, I'm going to use specific examples. If your analysis pre-specified people who identify as white and everyone else, non-white. Now, no one wants to be called non-white unless there's a cultural reason for it. So you want to, if you're going to do that, and there's a good statistical reason for that comparison, you want to justify it, and you want to be sure to list everyone who's included in that other group. Some editors might push back and say, well, why did you do that? Well, because we wanted to find an effect. That's not going to be a good enough reason. If instead it's because we're studying a specific disparity and there's prior research that has justified that, that's what we want to hear. Does that help answer your question?
I think so. I think it's an emphasis on the justification of why you are conducting that analysis that way.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
I think Graham, your hand is next.
Graham, Yeah, or Graham maybe first.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much. This is extremely interesting stuff. I was curious about what you were talking about with identity first when discussing patients with particular diagnoses. We work with post-traumatic stress disorder. What do you do with something like a psychopathology where having the psychopathology is sort of defined by the fact that you are suffering from it? And if you weren't suffering from it or per se inflicted with it, then you would sort of not have it. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, Graham, great question. We publish a lot on PTSD. We would word that as patients who were diagnosed with PTSD, patients who have symptoms, because sometimes depending on the tool that's being used, you're not actually measuring DSM criteria for PTSD, but you have people who have symptoms that might be, you might be actually trying to figure out which people meet a cutoff for a diagnosis. So we wouldn't say those who suffer with PTSD. It's not to say that PTSD is not terrible, and that can be described, but when you're actually talking about these patients, the idea is that they can hopefully recover, learn coping skills, get treatment, get therapy, get other support, that they're not going to just stay in that state. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. Very interesting. The way that reframing all of these things, very interesting. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Nicole?
Hi, so I'm from the Inherited Neuropathy Consortium, and we have been working on a set of race and ethnicity categories to be used across our consortium, including patients outside of the US, because the NIH's categories don't really capture the diversity in the UK or Italy. Anyway, we have run into a challenge where some of the wording in the UK's race and ethnicity categories are offensive in the US. And one term in particular, we spoke with someone who's like, no, this is my identity. And if we change it, then we're kind of centering the US's preferences over other countries. So what should we do in a case like that?
I think the best thing you can do is understand what the category is and make sure it is very clearly explained. So in some of the examples that Annette gave, for example, the visible minorities, that is the actual legal term that is used in Canada. And everywhere it appears, there's a parenthetical note that explains who is in this category and why we used it.
Okay.
Yeah, you might find also, in some countries, France, it's illegal to talk about race. I'll try to send to Thomas a link to the Royal Society of Chemistry has been developing a schema for people to identify their ethnic ancestry and race internationally, and to be able to identify with as many categories as possible. We're going to be experimenting with it. It's been tested by a lot of investigators, by the publishers that publish Nature journals and Elsevier journals. So I think you might find that interesting. Again, you have to go based on the databases that you're dealing with. How you report it is where you have some flexibility in describing it and not necessarily using a specific term.
Okay, thank you.
One comment in the chat, it says that, or the question is, how much overlap do you have with other style recommendations? For example, the New York Times use of white and black. So that also was one of my questions. So how much these guidelines are used by other journals and across the board, because I think it's going to be very important at the end when we want to do any sort of studies, like based on some language recognition or processing, or maybe some meta-analysis, that we have to use the same terms all over, because otherwise it's going to be very difficult to compare different studies across the board.
That's a good point. For the first part of that, we actually play very nicely with a lot of other style guides, and our recommendations are very similar to, for example, the American Psychological Association, otherwise known as the APA. So our style guides are very similar. as far as race and ethnicity, and they've also done more with their inclusive language, sex and gender and disabilities. Also, the Council of Science Editors is releasing a new scientific style guide, and they'll also be very, very similar. We are very similar to AP with some exceptions. The only thing with race and ethnicity that we disagreed on was the capitalization of white. So they capitalize all racial and ethnic terms except white. And we actually had a back and forth with them, and they're sticking with the lowercase, whereas APA and AMA have decided to just, for consistency's sake, to capitalize everything. So largely, I think you will see a lot of similarity across a lot of style guides. A lot of institutions, organizations, and industry use AMA, so there should be, a pretty broad acceptance of the terms in our guidance. And as far as consistency, you'll find it across anything. Not just inclusive language, but how diseases and things are described. And that just requires a lot of negotiation with researchers, with authors, to be as consistent as possible. But there is no universal guidance. So we're trying to work with organizations, as Annette mentioned, the Royal Society of Chemistry, to make sure it's as broadly accepted as possible. But to your point, there is no one standard at this point.
And for meta-analyses, with any data in a meta-analysis, you've got to have a data dictionary, right? So if you're collapsing things, even just reporting age is going to be different or not reported at all. Sometimes you have to actually go to the researcher because they didn't report the age, and you have to ask them. So that would be part of that, I think, as part of the plan for a meta-analysis.
And I have, maybe you haven't talked about that, and it may not relate to race and ethnicity, but sometimes when we talk to our individuals with different conditions, and of course we use the term quite often, that patient, but they don't really prefer to use the word patient. So they like to be referred an individual with a certain condition. So how do you look at that? So what is the guidance, for example, in JAMA, do you use the term of patients, or you prefer to have an individual with a certain condition instead of a patient with something?
Context, depends on the context. So we may be actually referring to participants, right? So there's a trial and they're all participants, right? If it's a study about management of a specific disease, patients might work, but we're totally fine with individuals if that's what the author preference is. Or groups or communities. We'll follow the author preference for that, for sure.
Okay, and somebody just had a chat that Tara is having a question, or her hands it up, but I cannot see that. But Tara?
Hey there. I'm also with the Inherited Neuropathies Consortium. I had a couple of follow-up questions on Latino and Latina. Obviously, that is kind of dichotomizing things and instilling gender in it, but I'm curious if people of Latin descent would be preferred over that.
I think we would recommend what was the framework used in this study. Did you use NIH categories? Did you use US worse census categories? Then you want to stick with what the options were. If it's international, Latin descent might actually be more acceptable. But again, we want you to define the subgroups. That's a very big group of people from Latin descent, and it crosses the ocean. So it's a really good question. We just ask people to be faithful to what was in their study design and in the tools that they used to collect that information, with preference for self-report, if at all possible.
Great. Yeah, it seems like it's becoming very important to be thinking about this throughout the entire process as well. And then the other term I was curious about is Aboriginal. To me, I think of the ab part being similar to abnormal. Where do we know within the Aboriginal community, is it an accepted term, or would Indigenous be preferred?
I think indigenous is a really good term, but Aboriginal is also sometimes a census term or a legal term. So I think it's important to understand the context of how the data were collected and reported, in a study.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much.
There is-
I can see a question here. Our studies are using Hispanic and non-Hispanic, and should we change this? This is a great question. So if you're reading a study and you have used NIH or US Census, which asks about race separate from ethnicity as separate entities, and then you put them together, and so you defined Hispanic and then non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic White, and so on. We're okay with that if that's what was used in the study design, but if it gets a little redundant, repeated, so we might at first mention suggest for the first use of non-Hispanic Black, parentheses hereafter Black, non-Hispanic White, parentheses hereafter White. So at first mention maybe in the abstract, or at first mention in the methods, and maybe even put a footnote in the table. That just kind of cleans up the wording a little bit so that you're not having to. Now, sometimes that's very important, that non-Hispanic differentiator. So that's really going to be up to your study design and what you're looking at, if you have the flexibility to do as I just said.